Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program today. Program today is being brought to you by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is one of the core associations of the Universal Peace Federation. So our mission in this association is to attract and develop innovative business, government, and economic thought leaders who can collectively impact society through collaboration, education, personal development, and deepened relationships that lead to the creation of a global environment that's conducive to mutual prosperity between nations, between companies, and between individuals in the world, so that we can make this world a better place for everyone to live in. So let me introduce our topic for today. It's a little bit out of our ordinary realm of expertise, but I think you'll find it relevant. So history, we're looking at history. History is both what happened and what people remember, think, or believe actually happened. So this incident that we're looking at, the General Sherman incident, occurred in 1866, and it provides a revealing illustration of this twofold understanding of history. At that time, a foreign ship owned by an American but chartered by British merchants and largely staffed or manned by Asian sailors illegally sailed up the Taedong River to the outskirts of Pyongyang in the summer of 1866. And then clashes occurred with the local Koreans that led to its fiery demise. And this is largely forgotten in the United States, but this incident has been remembered and reimagined in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which North Korea, as not only the beginning of 150 years of enmity between Korea and the rest of the world, and especially with the United States, but it is also the beginning point of modern Korean history. And moreover, as the story has been told and retold in North Korea, it became a linchpin in the unfolding narrative of the Kim's clan, of the Kim clan's bold and innovative resistance to American imperialism, sort of both the economic kind and the military kind. So our principal speaker today is Dr. Kirk Larson. He's an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. His research interests include foreign relations in East Asia, imperialism, and US East Asia relations. He's the recipient of the BYU History Department's Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award in 2010 and the Bender Teaching Award from George Washington University in 2006. He has a number of publications. I sent out some of those in the email, and you can look those up and purchase them if you like. But he's published and presented and commented on a variety of contemporary issues, including East Asian foreign relations, North Korea, nationalism and elections in South Korea, and Sino-Korean relations. He's appeared on numerous media broadcasts, including ABC, MSNBC, Voice of America, the Canadian Broadcast System, and Al Jazeera. So Dr. Larson, I invite you now to present your research on the General Sherman incident of 1866.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks to Roger and Alan and others for arranging this. I'm looking forward to having a conversation about an event that, as Roger indicated, is one that most people outside of Korea, at least, have completely forgotten about. And I am going to approach it in that kind of two-pronged way. That I think it's the job of scholarly historians like myself to try to determine as best as we can what really happened in a particular event based on the best available sources, but also to explore what people say, think, or believe about what happened, regardless of whether it really happened or not, because both of those shape how we view ourselves, how we view our relations with others, and so on. So I want to start out with what really happened. And in this case, what happened is in August of 1866, a foreign ship entered Korea, technically the Joseon Kingdom, which in the 19th century especially was known by some outsiders, like the missionary and scientist William Elliot Griffiths. The Korea was known as a hermit kingdom, a hermit nation, a place that did not want to have much in the way of relations with the outside world. Now, I think that characterization of Korea is sometimes a bit exaggerated. The Joseon Kingdom did have fairly robust interactions and relations with neighboring China or the Qing Empire. Also, some relations with then Tokugawa Japan. But it is the case that if others who weren't from Asia, especially if Westerners appeared on Korea's shores, they were often treated rather cordially and generously, but were quickly told that their presence here was undesired and that they should leave as quickly as possible. And so in the 19th century, the hermit characterization, especially vis-a-vis Westerners, is a fairly accurate one. But nonetheless, a foreign ship decided, despite this, to try to approach Korea and actually penetrate deep into the interior of the nation. And the result is this unfortunate clash and conflict. The ship's name is usually listed as the General Sherman, though sometimes just the Sherman. And there's actually a large amount of misunderstanding, mistaken understandings about the nature of the ship. Many sources written later characterize it as a steamship. But for reasons that I won't go into detail here, but can discuss in the Q&A if we wish, I have scoured every available contemporary source, and I am confident in my characterization that the General Sherman was not a steamship. It was a schooner, a sailing vessel that had a couple of masts and sails, but no other means of propulsion. Whatever the case, this ship originated in China and originated in the coastal city of Chifu or Zhifu, and it sailed from there across the Yellow Sea. On board were at least 2 British subjects, 2 or 3 Americans, it depends on which account one follows, and then anywhere between 18 to 25 Asian sailors, mostly Chinese, but perhaps some Southeast Asian as well. This was chartered by a British company called Meadows and Company, but it was owned by an American by the name of William Ballard Preston, and he was on board the ship. Despite Korea's designation as a hermit, in the 19th century, there actually were any number of foreign ships that often appeared on Korea's shores for various reasons. They may have been Western explorers, they may have been merchants or whalers. In some cases, they didn't necessarily intend to reach Korea, but they were blown off course. Whatever the case, the sight of a foreign ship on the coast was not entirely unheard of or unknown at this time. But what the General Sherman did was a bit different than these other ships that sometimes appeared on Korea's coast, because after encountering a few offshore islands and sailing along the coast, it made its way to the mouth of the Taedong River, the river that flows past Pyongyang, the current capital of the DPRK, North Korea. It was then the provincial capital of Pyongyang province. And a really critical moment in this ship's progress was when it reached a place called Gupsungmun, the Rushing Waters Gate. And this is a bend in the river where you can no one can pretend any longer that we're in the ocean, that we're in a bay or we're on the coast. Instead, you are clearly entering a river and sailing upstream into the interior. And that's exactly what the General Sherman did. And as it made its way up the river, it would sometimes stop, and some of the crew would make landfall and have some kinds of interactions with local Koreans. And in several cases, a local official, a local county magistrate or a local military official would quickly rush to the spot where the encounter is taking place and would inform the General Sherman that its presence here was illegal and unwanted and that it needed to leave and go home. But the crew of the General Sherman steadfastly and repeatedly said, no, we are going to continue to sail up the Taedong River. They repeatedly declared that we are here to trade. We have goods on board this ship that we want to trade with locals, and we're not going to leave until we do that. Ultimately, it makes its way up to the outskirts of Pyongyang, which of course was much smaller then than it is today, but still a significant town, city in Joseon, Korea. Here's a map with some of the English language designations of modern day Pyongyang. And you can see that, the ship reached the literal outskirts of the city. And as it was doing so, it was navigating a river that is filled with islets and islands and hidden sandbars. And by most accounts, at one point, the ship actually runs aground on a sandbar and gets stuck. After this, what happens is not entirely clear because there are multiple accounts, though none by the actual crew of the ship itself. But some of the accounts indicate that some of the crew members of the General Sherman, after it became aground on the sandbar, went ashore and by some accounts stole things, raided. By other accounts, actually attacked and raped local women, and otherwise engaged in conflict with the locals that at least in one case left at least one Korean dead, if not more. Better verified by the official Korean sources is the fact that the crew of the General Sherman also kidnapped a local Korean official and held him on board the ship for a few days before he managed to escape. So the local authorities, seeing all of this, were increasingly frustrated, angry, incensed, and the governor of Pyongan province, a gentleman by the name of Park Gyu-soo, basically writes to the central Korean government, the Joseon government, and reports what's going on, and asks for permission to attack and destroy the ship. And here is how the Kojong Shillok, the official dynastic record of the time of the reign of King Kojong, characterized the conversation at court. With Park Gyu-soo writing, "How can they be allowed to run rampant as they please? Shouldn't they be utterly destroyed?" And then the reply is, "Royal permission is granted." But note here that I put in brackets "too late," because if the date of this entry in the Kojong Shillok is correct, Pak had already authorized the attack on the ship before he could have received this news. He had already determined to do this before the supposed official central permission was granted. And initially, there were attempts to attack the ship using bows and arrows and rocks and other things like that. None of that terribly effective. But ultimately, the tactic of using fire ships, of putting a large amount of wood and kindling in small ships, setting it on fire, and then pushing it in the direction of the General Sherman in the hopes that it would collide with it and set General Sherman on fire, which ultimately succeeded after several attempts. And so the General Sherman catches fire, burns. Most of the crew die in the fire, but there are at least some accounts of some of the crew actually swimming ashore, at which point they were promptly executed by Koreans on shore. And so no one survives from the ship. So this makes it an interesting historical question. How do we know exactly what happened when we only have half of the story? We only have the story of what Koreans report and not what happens on from the viewpoint of those actually on board. But nonetheless, there is quite a bit of abundant official reports and other accounts that allow me to sort of relay the narrative that I just gave you about this foreign ship that sailed up the Taedong River, and though repeatedly warned that its presence there was unwelcome and illegal, continued to do so. All sorts of potential encounters with local Koreans, and then ultimately being destroyed and everyone on board is killed. So that's what happened. But the other strand of history is, what do people believe about what happened? And here we're talking more about narrative, about memory, about myth. In some cases, this overlaps with what the available evidence supports, but in many cases it diverges. But nonetheless, really important, because it helps us understand how people understand their own history, and again, how they understand their interactions with others. So I want to share a few different narratives of this encounter from different groups of people. So the first one is the official North Korean account, things that we find in history textbooks and official statements and so on. And here, despite the fact that the General Sherman was chartered by a British company, there were British on board, as well as a number of Asian sailors, in the North Korean account, the General Sherman is purely American. It's almost always depicted as flying an American flag, and it is regarded as an encounter between the United States and Korea. And more than this, it is almost always depicted as an official American assault on Korea. This is something orchestrated from Washington, that the United States ordered the ship to go do this. And as such, it is sort of the beginnings of decades and then a century and a half or more of conflict between Koreans and Americans. Again, thought to have begun with this official attempt by the American government to attack Korea. As often happens in these narratives, certain embellishments and exaggerations creep in. One of my favorite ones is related by the Korean Central News Agency in 2015 that declared that the General Sherman was the most advanced warship of its time. Again, the evidence to support that is completely absent, but nonetheless, that's some of the types of claims that are being made in North Korea. But here we can look at a North Korean high school history textbook and find a statement by Kim Il-sung, and you can know that it's his because it's bolded to indicate that, that this is something that students should really pay close attention to. And this statement is repeated over and over again in every history textbook of the period I've been able to find, as well as in other official statements and documents. And here's what Kim Il-sung says. For more than 100 years, beginning with the General Sherman invasion until now, the American imperialists have invaded our land and are the sworn enemies of the entire Korean people. And thus, this encounter, again, one that very few Americans even know about, becomes a central starting point for one of the most important North Korean narratives about how it interacts with the outside world, and particularly the United States. But there's more. As North Korean historians would get together and have discussions about how to frame the narrative of Korean history, it ultimately was decided that this moment, this encounter, is not only the beginning of Korean-American enmity and conflict, it's actually the beginning of modern Korean history. And so here's a translation of one sort of characterization of this by a North Korean historian. This is the year when the first beacon flared for the national struggle against foreign aggression, which was the most important form of the people's movement throughout the modern period, and also marks the beginning of the transformation of our country from a feudal to a modern society. And so much like the first Opium War in 1839 to 42 functions in the Chinese historical narrative as this hinge point, this pivot between the feudal period and the modern period, the General Sherman incident appears to occupy the same space in the North Korean official narrative. And this is illustrated in all sorts of interesting ways, but one of my favorite illustrations is this multi-volume series of Korean history called The History of Korea, Joseon Jeonsa. And volume 13 is when the recent period, the modern period, begins. And so you look at the title and it looks like this, and then you turn the page over to see the end notes, the thing that's it's right when you turn the page over. And what do you see? The General Sherman being destroyed by fire ships. This is the beginning. This is where it all starts. And this kind of narrative has been fairly consistent from the earliest sources I've been able to track down, which were produced in the 1950s, all the way up to the present day. And there's been a consistent and abiding feature of the North Korean historical narrative. But within this narrative, one sees a really interesting transformation. Sources in the 50s and the 60s talk about the Korean people, the Korean masses that got together and in their righteous indignation attacked the General Sherman fire ships and destroyed it. And this is not entirely unexpected if you're adopting a kind of Marxist class struggle way of understanding the world and how things work. Then you credit the masses, you credit the people with being agents of change. But starting in the 1960s and then really picking up steam in the 1970s, the narrative shifts, because out of the anonymous masses of the Korean people, suddenly we see a leader. And this leader is a gentleman by the name of Kim Il-woo, who just happens to be Kim Il-sung's great-grandfather. And so instead of the Korean people working together as a class to resist imperialism, now it's a particular family, a clan, who takes the leadership role. And as these narratives expand, Kim Il-woo is credited with more and more brilliance and charisma and patriotism, and he becomes the central figure in this story. And here's one of my favorite illustrations of this. This is a mosaic in a North Korean park that lists several known historical figures who helped keep the country safe, helped protect the country. And at the bottom there, you see some luminaries of late 19th and early 20th century Korean history, like Kim Ok-gyun, Jang Bong-jun, An Jung-gun, and so on. But above them all, and in full color, much bigger, is Kim Il-woo. He is the key figure in this. And you can actually go to Pyongyang, to the shores, the banks of the Taedong River, where the General Sherman was destroyed. And there's now a large stone monument commemorating this. And in the very first line, explaining what's going on here, there's Kim Il-sung. He is, again, the central figure here. One always wonders how much of popular memory and perception monuments like these actually influence. I mean, do people even pay attention? It's hard to know from time to time. But it's clear that this is a place where North Koreans go, and they see this, and one would have to think that at least some degree they're influenced by the narrative that monuments like this contain. So those are a couple of strands of the North Korean side of things. What about South Korea? Some South Korean history textbooks are remarkably similar to the North Korean ones, saying that the General Sherman was an official attempt by the United States to invade or open or attack Korea. But the majority simply lists the General Sherman alongside a whole host of other strange foreign ships, some from France, some from Britain, some from Russia, some from Japan, who appeared in increasing frequency on Korea's shores. And it's not really given the centrality that you see in most of the North Korean narratives. It's just one of many of these increasing encounters with foreigners that pave the way for the opening of Korea, which happens, of course, at the hands of Japan in 1876. But within the larger national Korean historical narrative, there is sort of a sub-narrative held dear by many South Koreans, and that's the Christian narrative. As you all know, anywhere between 25 and 40% of South Koreans self-identify as Christian. And for many of them, the General Sherman incident is not this fiery conflict between Koreans and Americans. It's the true beginnings of Protestant Christianity in Korea. And that's because one of the British subjects that was on board the General Sherman is this gentleman, Robert Germaine Thomas, a Welsh missionary who trained and studied and then went to China to spread the word of the gospel there. But he felt this sort of call to leave China and go to Korea. And he actually had made a clandestine trip to Korea the year before in 1865. He got some Chinese ships to take him over, and he spent several weeks going up and down the western coast of Korea, meeting with people, learning a little Korean, and then returned to China. But when he heard about the General Sherman that wanted to go to Korea, he volunteered to be its guide, its interpreter. The official Korean accounts of encounters with Thomas make it clear that perhaps he had a higher estimation of his Korean linguistic ability than he actually possessed, because many of them say, yeah, there's this guy on board that tries to speak Korean, but we can't really figure out what he says. And so we have to sit down with the Chinese crewmen and write to communicate what's going on. But nonetheless, he was clearly going on this venture, not to trade, but rather to share Protestant Christianity in Korea. And while the official Korean accounts of encounters up the Taedong River mention him, they don't mention what many Protestant Christians remember, which is that he often went on shore and passed out Bibles by the dozens, if not the hundreds, that he met with dozens, if not hundreds, in some cases thousands of Koreans. And this, in many respects, constitutes the first full-scale proselytization of Protestant Christianity in Korea. And some of the accounts indicate that Thomas was one of the crew members who actually swam to shore as the ship was burning down and was promptly killed, making him perhaps the first Protestant martyr in Korea. Now, I spent with my family the Christmas holiday in Rome, and one of the things that I noticed as I visited cathedrals and museums there was the centrality of martyrdom in the Roman Catholic narrative, that everywhere you look is St. Agnes and St. Sebastian and a whole host of other martyrs. Obviously, it does not play as prominent a role in most Protestant narratives, but nonetheless, sort of an important distinction that many Korean Christians maintain to this day. But perhaps more important than his status as a martyr was the fact that many Korean Christians believed that his efforts were not completely in vain, that some of the people that he gave Bibles to converted and became some of the earliest Protestant converts in Korea. And some Christian accounts actually credit him with handing his last Bible to the man who promptly beheaded him as he swam ashore as the General Sherman was burning down, but that this soldier later converted, according to some Christian accounts. Another memorable Christian account says that a local official rounded up all these illegal Bibles that Thomas had been distributing, and actually had used the paper from some of them to wallpaper his house, and then later read what was contained in his wallpaper, and he too supposedly converted. A really interesting example of this sort of counter narrative, or this different way of understanding this encounter, can be found on Baekneung Island. This is an island off of the coast of North Korea, but it's technically South Korean territory there. And this is actually where the General Sherman first made landfall in Korea, before it sailed up the coast and ultimately up the Taedong River. And I visited this island a few years ago, and among other things, there is a small museum about the beginnings of Protestant Christianity in Korea, and especially on this island. And Thomas is given sort of pride of place, really important figure in this narrative. And dioramas showing him sharing the gospel with local Koreans and so on. And while the ultimate violent demise of the General Sherman is mentioned in this narrative, it's clear that that's not the story that's being told here. The more important story is he introduced Protestant Christianity to Korea, and one result is that even though there aren't that many people that live on Baekneung Island, there are multiple Christian churches there because of sort of his efforts and the efforts of those that followed up. And there have been some attempts to maintain this sort of connection between Korean Christians and Wales, where Thomas is from. And there have been many accounts of Korean Christians actually making pilgrimages to Wales to visit the places where Thomas was born and where he grew up and so on, to sort of increase this connection between the origins of Protestant Christianity and its supposed originator. And then one really interesting, I haven't found a lot more to sort of show how widespread this is, but I did stumble across a Welsh business magazine talking about different business opportunities, and this particular article talking about the business of relationships, about how there are opportunities to be had in Korea, notes that Wales may actually have the leg up on some other possibilities because of the General Sherman incident, because of the fact that Thomas was Welsh and ushered in sort of the beginnings of this. All right, really quickly, what about the United States? As we've already sort of mentioned, the General Sherman has largely been forgotten. Very, very few, if any, Americans know about this story at all. But I will note that in the years immediately following 1866, the U.S. Navy sent a couple of missions to Korea to investigate what happened, to inquire what happened to the ship, what happened to our subjects, our citizens that we presume are dead. And while the Korean response was consistent, that this ship sailed illegally or wasn't supposed to be, it attacked our people, and so we attacked it and destroyed it. The American naval officials declared themselves unsatisfied with this explanation. They kept sort of wanting more acknowledgement and perhaps even apology for it. And this does lead to the next significant encounter between Koreans and Americans, and that's the Low Rogers expedition of 1871, when 5 American gunboats sailed to Korea, ostensibly to invite the Joseon Kingdom to open up to diplomatic and commercial relations, much like Commodore Perry had done with Japan a couple of decades before. But a strong sort of undercurrent in the writings of both the commanders of this expedition and also regular soldiers and sailors that were on board was, we're also here that if things don't turn out diplomatically, we're here to teach the Koreans a lesson, that you can't treat our American subjects like you did the General Sherman. And the end result was a conflict in which the gunboats attacked some coastal fortifications on Kangwa Island and then stormed ashore and destroyed those fortifications and killed upwards of 350 Koreans at the loss of 3 American lives. Rather a lopsided battle, to be sure. And it's interesting to note that therefore more people died in this conflict than died at Little Bighorn or San Juan Hill or any number of other conflicts that are much better known and remembered in the American historical imagination than this particular Korean-American encounter. And then one last thing about the American side of things, and then I'll finish. I've noticed an interesting sort of juxtaposition about the characterization of the 2 main groups, the foreigners on board the General Sherman and the Koreans on shore. In North Korea, the depiction of the General Sherman and his crew is pretty consistent. And the depiction and the characterization is that these guys are pirates. And so here's one North Korean publication that says, as soon as they entered our territorial waters, the pirates on board the General Sherman bluntly revealed their true colors as scouts of aggression and plunderers. And pictorial depictions, like these selections from North Korean historical comic books that I've gathered, are consistently have the crew of the General Sherman with all the things straight out of central casting for pirates. Striped shirts, eye patches, free-flowing grog, all the rest. And this is a very consistent portrayal in North Korean sources. And I dare say that while I don't want to come across as sounding like a North Korean apologist, I don't think they're entirely wrong here. I mean, at minimum, the General Sherman were illegally penetrating a country that made it very clear they didn't want to be there, inviting people to trade, so at minimum, smugglers. And then if even only a fraction of the stories told about what the General Sherman's crew did to people on shore, rape, pillage, stealing, killing, all these things put together sounds fairly piratical to me. But it's interesting to contemplate what happens when the story of the General Sherman starts to get out in the Western media, the English writing media, especially in the United States, but to some degree in Britain and elsewhere. And here, the roles shift. Now it's the Koreans who are the pirates. And so here's one little report in the Washington Evening Star that combines together, I don't know how many historical mistakes, but the American steamer General Sherman was captured by pirates on the river leading to Peking. Well, not exactly. Her crew was tied to the mast and vessel destroyed and burned. Here's another one from the Chicago Tribune talking about the way that the crew of the General Sherman were tortured, exhibited to the natives, and then someone escaped coming to tell the story. Again, none of this is verifiably true, but nonetheless, it's sort of the accounts that were replete in especially the American media. A couple more, General Sherman was seized by pirates in the river leading to the capital. And so suddenly it's not the crew that are the pirates, it's the Koreans who attack the ship that are the pirates. And the end result is fairly predictable. Here's the New York Times in 1867 that's saying that, this is nothing new. This is what Koreans are. As these pirates of Korea have for a long time been guilty of a series of similar cruelties against the seafaring people of all nations, our government ought at once to take steps to so effectually punish them that a good sound chastisement shall compel them hereafter to abstain from a repetition of such crimes. The savages want a thrashing. It should be a right hearty one. And arguably, that's exactly what happened in 1871 when 350 Korean soldiers perished at the hands of Americans who were attacking Kangwa Island. And this trope of Koreans as pirates continues. Here's an article about the 1871 encounter written nearly 50 years after that the subheading says, 47 years ago, the United States Navy cleaned out a nest of Korean pirates. This is sort of who the Koreans are. They attack anyone that comes on their shore. So seeing this American narrative about Koreans and how they supposedly treat foreigners, I went back and tried to find every account I could of every single encounter of a foreign ship appearing on Korea's shores in the 19th century. And I've yet to find a single one before 1866 that was violent or that displays this kind of interaction. Rather, every single time, if they're shipwrecked, the shipwreck victims are given food and supplies, but then hurriedly escorted to either China or Japan. If they're not shipwrecked, they are in many cases treated with a banquet, a meal, but then again told, your presence is not here, please go away. But in no cases have I found before 1866 of Koreans actually attacking foreign ships, of stealing their things, of doing all the other things that pirates supposedly do. I will note that one British newspaper in 1871 basically came to the same conclusion. Materials are scanty, it reads, but they all bear witness to the humanity and kindliness of the Koreans. And so it's interesting to contemplate where this switch comes from. And I would argue that it comes from the all too human tendency to actually not really look for evidence, but rather go in with preconceived notions about what you think other people are like and how they behave, and then not adjusting those views even when the evidence shows you otherwise. And sadly, I'm afraid that this happens all too often in especially sort of Korean-American relations, with Americans having a preset narrative of who Koreans are and what they do, and then refusing to update that narrative based on the evidence that they receive. So again, those are many different ways in which this one seemingly minor incident have been remembered and re-remembered by different groups. But I've already gone on too long, so I will end it there and look forward to talking about it.
Thank you very much, Kirk. That was a very interesting presentation and had a lot of information that I have not heard before. And it makes you realize, I think, that fake news is not just something that's a modern day phenomenon, right?
Definitely.
going on for a long time. So to respond to your presentation, we'd like to invite Dr. Thomas Saliva. He's the International Co-Coordinator for the International Association of Academicians for Peace and is the International President of the Professors World Peace Academy. He's previously served as president of the Sonhak UP Graduate University in Seoul, Korea, and holds a doctorate in comparative religion and East Asian philosophy from Harvard University. So Dr. Saliva has taught at universities and colleges in Canada and the US, as well as in China and Korea. And his current research focus is on the values of human relatedness in promoting a society of interdependence and mutual prosperity. And I think given the misunderstandings that happened between the Koreans and the US in these early days, it's probably very appropriate for you to respond to this.
Yes, thank you very much, Roger. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Kirk Larson, for your stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. I'm reminded of the Taoist sage Zhuangzi, who, by way of numerous fables and fantastic stories, reminds readers that our experiences in life are perspectival, that individuals and groups understand events from their own points of view, relative to their own circumstances. And as a result, just as we've heard, history as we know it is an ambiguous and multivalent mixture. Facts, misremembered facts, and self-interested interpretations are all interwoven together. As Professor Larson has just shown us, the General Sherman incident is a great example of this perspectival phenomenon. The incident is remembered differently, for some nearly forgotten, while for others, it is the event that triggered and shaped national destiny. Now, the Taoist fables seem to teach that we are fated to be bound by our perspectives, by the perceptions that accompany our roles in the events of our lives. But those same stories also imply that it is possible to become aware of our perspectival limitations, and through a measure of humility, perhaps, and reflection, to imagine beyond those limitations, and so, perhaps, to act differently going forward. And that's a possibility that I want to explore. First, in thinking about the General Sherman incident and its meaning for today, I think it's helpful to keep the wider frame in mind, as Professor Larson mentioned at several points. China at this time, in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, this is the time period that mainland Chinese refer to as the beginning of a century of humiliation. After the Opium Wars, beginning in 1839, 1840, China was in the process of being, as they say, carved up like a ripe melon by the Western European powers, especially Britain and France. The humiliation of being reduced to a semi-colony, Benjamin D., is not easily forgotten. Now, for Americans in those Chinese areas, the Americans benefited from the concessions that Britain and France had won. A classic book on the American role in East Asia is titled The Sentimental Imperialists. Right? And who? Us? How could that be? We're the good guys, aren't we? We don't quite recognize this, at least this perception of who we are. And then over in Japan, as was mentioned, Commodore Perry forcefully and forcibly opened Japan for trade in 1853-54, after 250 years of controlled access on the part of the Japanese rulers. Earlier than others in East Asia, the Japanese read the handwriting on the wall in the form of the 1868 Meiji Restoration, which of course had major implications for the whole world in the following decades. So in that context, it's not surprising that the Koreans didn't want to give access and were not sure how to best survive in the midst of all these unpredictable changes that were taking place all around them. Now, it's interesting, the highlight on the Protestant Christian interpreter, E.J. Thomas, as a kind of important figure in this whole drama. And it shows the entanglement, we might say, of the Christian mission with Western economic interests, aided and abetted at times by political and military interests. It's a paradox, because the missionaries needed some kind of foundation on which to enter a sovereign realm. And yet there's a tendency to think that religion is either irrelevant to real interests, or perhaps that religion is the ultimate culprit. Now, suppose we could replay these events of 1866. What could or should have happened instead? For example, what might R.J. Thomas, what might he have done differently than he did? He was the communication channel with the Koreans to some extent, as Professor Larson has pointed out. But what could he have done differently in order to avoid tragedy and arrive at a more heavenly outcome? This kind of thought experiment might give us a clue as to what we may learn from the incident for us today. Since he was a missionary, could there be a providential view in this picture somewhere? Could there have been a sensitivity to the divine dream, an inclusive, peace-centered future hope, having much in common with common basic human hopes? This is the kind of question that the UPF founders, Dr. Sun Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, urge us to ask. Now, since this webinar is hosted by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, let's consider some of the economic aspects of this General Sherman incident. We can see the ambiguities of the concept of free trade, which is full of uncertainties for those who are the object of the offer of free trade, in this case, the American offer of opening up for trade. Free trade and its motivations. That's very simple. You have stuff that our markets want, and we have stuff that you need to buy. What's so hard about that? So free trade has got this coercive dimension to it that we really need to be aware of and to think about. So fast forward to the present, would free trade be the simple solution to reunification on the Korean Peninsula today? If so, why isn't the North buying it? Why are they not welcoming it? We can see from this incident that this incident now supports the whole narrative of why exactly North Koreans should not trust the Americans and should not budge on control of their own economy. Now, how might the concepts of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values that PWPA and UPF both promote, how might these concepts be helpful, both in analyzing the historical event and perhaps shaping a restorative response? I have a couple of little bit more focused questions. The General Sherman incident was a dangerous encounter indeed. It took some time before there's a reaction. So I'm wondering, to Professor Larson, a little bit about the sense of timing, that maybe it's just a matter of communication, but it took a while before there was an attempt to not only find out what happened, but to a kind of punitive endeavor. So help us understand a little bit this question about timing. And I'm curious whether the Koreans would have been aware of the Commodore Perry expedition and its consequences. I wonder if that's something that's also actively in the background of those at the time. But certainly later, it is an active consideration. In many ways, the United States of 1866
I'm sorry, Thomas, you got muted. Can you unmute yourself?
I thought you were telling me my time was up, and it might
No,
be
no.
almost up. So
Sorry.
feel free to do that. In many ways, the US of 1866, having just survived the American Civil War, was rather different from the United States of 1950, which came to the rescue of the Southerners on the Korean Peninsula. So I'm wondering, as a nation, have we grown beyond some of the limitations that this 1866 incident shows us? What, Dr. Larson, what do you think we Americans need to understand about this incident? What are its implications in terms of current US-North Korean relations? Is it possible to learn from history? And if it is, what elements of the General Sherman incident ought not to be repeated? Is there a way to dislodge the North Korean narrative of 150 years of enmity? Is there anything that American political leaders can do, or American civil society could do, to kind of defang this evidence of enmity from 1866? And then lastly, for the IAED, what kinds of economic development are we talking about? Is it something more than the proposition that was offered to the Koreans in 1866? Are there new ways that economic development can contribute to mutual human development, both on the Korean Peninsula and in our wider world? So those are my questions. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you. Thank you. Very informative response there and some good questions. So let's bring Dr. Larson back on, and we can have a little discussion here. And if anybody has additional questions that they would like to ask here, please post them in the chat. But Kirk, I'd like to give you first a chance to respond to those questions. And I think that there were a couple there. There was one is about the historical setting. How does this relate to Commodore Perry and the other issues that were going on in that part of the world? And then also, what can we learn today from this? So over to you.
Okay, thank you for that commentary. Really eye-opening, and I think encourages people like me that tend to approach this from a sort of a Western academic viewpoint to maybe broaden my horizons a bit and think about larger and wider implications. I really appreciate that. In terms of a few sort of historical context issues, the Korean court was aware that Japan had opened up to the outside world, and they were even more aware of what was going on in China, and were really worried about both of those things, and really concerned that they didn't want to have happen to them what appeared to be happening to their neighbors. And this arguably is one of the reasons why this determination to resist foreign incursions becomes stronger during this period. So that's definitely part of the context. It also is the case that it did take a while for the news of this event to get out, because everyone was killed, and so it took a while before people started to say, "Hey, what happened to that ship? Why hasn't it returned? Where is Reverend Thomas and other people?" And then as had been said, the fake news machine goes into high gear and reports on all sorts of things that simply weren't true. There were some early reports that at least some of the crew had returned to China and were telling their story. And then there were other reports about maybe not everyone on board was killed, and some of them were being held prisoner in Korea, and a whole host of other things. And again, it took a while before these official U.S. naval missions reapproached the peninsula and tried to get to the bottom of it. And we're told again a very consistent story, which is consistent with all the available historical records that I've been able to see, which is sort of the narrative that I've given you, that this illegal ship sailed up the river, its crew did all sorts of terrible things, and we really had no choice but to end it. But that was not really sort of accepted by the Americans. They wanted more. Not only reckoning with the story, but perhaps some kind of restitution or apology or other things like that. And so that does pave the way for the really unfortunate events of 1871. what can we know, or what can we take from this particular event to try to have better relations today? I think is a really interesting and important question. And I'll share a couple of anecdotes that I think, to me, illustrate the yawning chasm between the two historical narratives in North Korea and the United States. So years ago, I taught at the George Washington University. And while I was there, I was actually invited by the Korea desk of the State Department to come give a lecture. And they said, we want to know what we need to know from history to help us better do our jobs. And so I actually started out, I said, I want to sort of get a sense of your level of historical knowledge. And so who can tell me when and under what conditions did relations between Korea and the United States begin? And there was silence. And then crickets chirping. And then finally one gentleman raised his hand and said, well, didn't we sign a treaty in 1883? And the answer is, well, yeah, technically signed in 1882, but ratified in 1883. So who's counting? But that was the extent of the knowledge of U.S. diplomats who were tasked with managing relations with Korea. They didn't know any of this story. 2 weeks later, I was in New York City and was able to hear an address given by the then North Korean representative to the United Nations. So, the closest thing that North Korea has to an ambassador in the US. And he started out his remarks talking about 150 years of enmity between Korea and the United States. And I had the opportunity to go up after and ask him. I said, I'm an historian, I'm just really interested. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the guys down in Foggy Bottom. I said, under what conditions, under what circumstances did relations between Korea and the United States begin? And he didn't hesitate for a second. He said, General Sherman. Everybody knows that. That's how it began. And so I think one really important first step, it doesn't solve everything by any means, but one important first step is just to be aware of the different narratives, aware that Koreans have a very different narrative about how things began and what this all means than Americans do. And to be sort of charitable to Americans, the United States has been a globally engaged power for a century and a half. And so, the General Sherman is one in literally thousands of similar encounters with different peoples across the world. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard for Americans to sort of keep that all in our heads and keep that in our historical narrative. But if you're interested in a particular relationship, between the United States and one group of people, say people on the Korean Peninsula, then I think a really important first step is just simply knowing what their narratives are and understanding them. Not necessarily agreeing with everything, but at least that, I think that's an important starting point. And then more broadly, I think that as was said, that Americans were big proponents of free trade, and in fact there are a lot of not only U.S. naval officers but diplomats and others repeatedly in the 1860s and the early 1870s expressing this kind of frustration that Korea is the last place on earth that doesn't allow trade, and this just can't be allowed to continue. Everyone knows free trade is good for everybody. They need to learn this. We need to open Korea because that's just the way the world works.
Why do you think the Koreans were so opposed to the free trade?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One is this strong Confucian sense that of all the human activities, commerce is actually pretty low on the totem pole of respect. There's also a rather kind of conservative view of political economy and how that works, and this idea that we barely have enough to feed our own people. If foreigners come in, they're going to take some of that, and then that'll cause trouble. And so this general hostility toward trade. It's not universal, and there are actually some members of the so-called practical learning school that saw benefits in trade and wanted more of it. But they were the minority in the 19th century. The majority are still kind of opposing this whenever they could.
Because the Japanese also had that initial reaction
Yes.
to the coming in as well, until Commodore Perry forced the opening,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So one parallel or idea, I think, is the Juche ideology. How much do you think that has been influenced by this event that happened, 150 years earlier? because it also proposes this whole, self-reliance and isolationist kind of philosophy.
I mean, I think you see strands of what becomes Juche in how the General Sherman narrative is told in North Korea. A big part of Juche, whether explicitly stated or not, is the centrality of the Kim clan in defending Korean independence and self-reliance. And what better way to sort of hit that home than to say that we've been resisting the Americans ever since they showed up. I also think that there is something to the same idea of don't necessarily see free trade, foreign trade as a net good. That there are other values that are more important than the comparative advantage gains that you can get through mutual exchange. And for us, it's protecting our country and our traditions and our identity. And so I think both of those you can see. I haven't seen this particular incident invoked all that often in discussions of Juche. Though there are so many of those, I'm sure I probably missed a few.
Sure. And Dr. Saliva, would you like to add some further comments, or do you have any further questions that you'd like to ask them?
Well, I think as the flow is going along, that we really can learn quite a bit from this history, and because we have lots of concern about the present and future of the Korean Peninsula and how peaceful unification might actually happen. What does it mean? And then all those, this narrative, this competing narrative in a way really needs to be understood and thought about. And if there's a way to kind of reset it, what the UPF movement could do, or what others who would like to see a different and a brighter future on the Korean Peninsula for the North as well, what ought to be done? And that's the question that I'll be thinking about as a result of this presentation. Thank you very much.
I think there's a couple of questions we've had in the chat here that relate to the whole religious aspect of the mission. And I think that the religious and the economic side have been really integrated and kind of entwined together in this whole story, right? So how much do you think it was actually like a missionary attempt to open up Korea, and how much of it was the economic side?
That's a question that at the end of the day is probably impossible to answer because we can't interview any of those who did it. But it appears to me that the initial impetus was commercial, because it's Meadows and Company that's doing this, and the owner of Meadows and Company, Jonathan Meadows, I think very clearly thought that there was some money to be made here. But interesting, his brother was a British diplomat and was then serving in the British sort of consulate closest to the Korean border, and had repeatedly in the British press advocated for opening Korea. Korea needs to be open to outside trade. And so I think the two of them got together and said, if we can demonstrate how profitable this is, then maybe the British government will follow up and say, well, we should formalize this and make this, an actual diplomatic and commercial treaty relationship. And so I think that's the core impetus based on all the accounts, the data that I've been able to find. And it seems like Reverend Thomas just saw this as a chance to go back to Korea and continue what he had started the year before. He repeatedly attempted to make a distinction between his brand of Protestant Christianity and Catholicism, which was currently completely illegal and being heavily persecuted in Korea at the time. Though by some accounts, not all of the Koreans on shore got that distinction, and some of them actually thought that he was a French Catholic, which sort of added to, I think, maybe the tension that characterized all of these encounters.
Can you talk a little bit about that French Catholic thing? I'm not sure everybody's familiar with that. Can you?
So in the earlier decades of the 19th century, several French priests had smuggled themselves into Korea and started preaching and actually got a fair number of followers, of converts. And then there were a number of moments in the early 19th century in which the authorities sort of get wind of this and crack down. And in many cases, force converts to recant or die, and many of them chose not to recant and therefore were executed. And actually in 1866, the same year, 9 French priests were rounded up and executed. And soon after the General Sherman, the French Navy would come and try to attack Korea to punish it. Interestingly, Thomas had actually told the French that he would sail with them as their interpreter. But then the French Navy got distracted by some goings on in Indochina, and they delayed their punitive mission. And then Thomas heard about the General Sherman and said, well, I might as well just hop on this ship and go, because it's going now, and who knows when the French will get back.
I see. Interesting. So I think we should wrap up here. We're kind of at our time limit here. So Dr. Saliva, do you have some final comments that you would like to offer?
Well, I mean, I really do want to kind of press the point that in terms of thinking about the philosophy of IAED, and as a network, then, I mean, not only the Americans generally or others, but really as a network, then, what kind of stimulating thinking about the nature of interdependence and mutual prosperity vis-a-vis the current economic paradigms that are out there and that are in full force on the Korean Peninsula? I think this question really is important for us to think about. So thank you.
And Kirk, your final comments there?
I will just note there are a couple of really interesting questions in the chat that we didn't get to address. Yes, the 1871 event is in the first episode of Mr. Sunshine. It doesn't get all the details of it right, but it does sort of capture the feeling of that encounter. And then the reason why Protestant Christianity is later able to be actually quite successful in Korea, and especially in North Korea, is in part due to the treaties that Joseon Korea signed with various foreign powers in the 1880s. And the one with France actually kind of opened the door for proselytization by some really inventive interpretation of one of the clauses of that treaty. And the end result was a large number of Protestants coming to Korea, and again, finding a lot of success, especially in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, which is sort of ironic because that's Pyongyang was the Jerusalem of the East, and yet now it's in South Korea where Christianity is most successful and widespread today. But thanks for having me, and thanks for sort of reframing these historical encounters with this, I think, really admirable goal of trying to figure out how we can use them to better have more mutually beneficial, peaceful interactions with others. I love it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think both of you brought very valid points, and often the economic and the religious aspects really get intertwined. And I think from the North Korean perspective, they often see the economic overtures merely as a subterfuge to try and do religious proselytization. And this incident kind of illustrates that whole fact for us. So thank you very much, Dr. Larson and Dr. Saliva, for your great presentation today. And we'll see everybody again at the same time next week for another presentation on a different topic.